Welcome to the SynMax Intelligence Podcast, where we navigate the shadowy edges of global intelligence, energy, and security. Today's episode, maritime insurance. It sounds boring, right? We think of maritime insurance, most of us think of policies, premiums, and paperwork. Well, this is anything but. This is the financial armor behind a global trade system worth over $22 trillion a year. Every ship that sails carries more than cargo. It carries risk, real risk. Pirates still hijack vessels in the Gulf of Guinea. War risk zones shift overnight in the Red Sea and the Black Sea. Crews vanish. Ships go dark. Fraud is rampant. Kidnapping for ransom, state-backed sabotage, human trafficking. It's all happening right now on the sea. And out of hundreds of miles from shore, when alarms go off, help is hours, sometimes even days away. Vessels are alone with their crew, their cargo, whatever is coming next. Maritime insurance is what keeps this essential component of our global economy from financial ruin, and it's become one of the most complex and dangerous games in the world. We're pulling back the curtain, a billion-dollar bet made every day to keep global trade afloat. The quiet war rooms where insurers, intelligence analysts, and underwriters try to stay one step ahead of chaos. I'm Eric Anderson, and this is the SynMax Intelligence Podcast. Today's guest is Mike Salthouse. Mike is the head of external affairs at NorthStandard Limited. NorthStandard is the largest of the UK-managed Theia, which stands for Protection Indemnity Clubs, ensuring approximately 20% of the world's shipping, providing a range of services and products to the maritime industry. It is a member of the international group of P&I clubs, which collectively provide P&I insurance to approximately 88% of the world's fleet. A qualified solicitor, Mike spends most of his career involved in claims handling of North and England's claims department, immediately prior to the merger with Standard in 2022. Between 2011 and 22, he chaired the International Group Sanctions Committee and led industry discussions with states in the development of the Russian oil price cap scheme. Mike is a member of the Royal United Services Institute UK Sanctions Task Force and the separate Maritime Sanctions Task Force. In addition to his role at NorthStandard, Mike is a director of Maritime London, the industry associates which represent the UK's world-leading maritime professional services industry. Welcome to the podcast, Mike.
Thank you, Eric, and thanks for the very kind introduction.
Yeah, of course. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about NorthStandard. It's a fascinating company. It's got a very long history. In fact, the predecessor entities that formed NorthStandard have been operating in the maritime insurance industry for over 160 years. 160 years being an incredibly long time for anybody to operate, especially in such an incredibly risky business. So I want to ask you, what do you think sets NorthStandard apart, just differentiated it for such a long time?
That's a very good question. I think two things. Firstly, we are profoundly un-American. What do I mean by that?
Well, that always helps.
I mean we don't make a profit. We are a mutual. We're 100% owned by our ship owner members, and that does two things really. I think it gives us a very close relationship with our client base. In other words, if they are assuming new risk, or if they want us to flex our policies to cover something, then we get a very immediate and direct message from our customers, from our members, as to what the policy needs to respond to. So it's very agile, in spite of the fact that it's been around for such a long period of time. We have very close relationships with our customers, and we really understand what's necessary. Secondly, I think not all the clubs that sort of were founded back 160 years ago are still around. So I think the thing that perhaps uniquely differentiates NorthStandard and now NorthStandard really has been a sort of a passion for the business. I come from the north side of the business. We're based up in Newcastle. We're not in London. We've been very proud of the fact that we've been able to come through and offer a product which has proven very attractive to the world ship owners, so that we've grown market share when we're actually, when we're sort of firmly entrenched outside London. We're representing a region in the United Kingdom which historically has not been one of the most prosperous areas. So it's a mixture of local pride and having a very flexible, agile product in touch with its customer base.
And have you seen the industry, just maritime insurance in general, NorthStandard, evolve over the course of your career?
It's changed profoundly. I can really only speak for the north side of the business. When I started, we were what we were employing about 60 people. We had one office up in Newcastle, and we insured about 8.5 million tons. Today, we insure 371 million tons. I've lost count of the number of offices we've got. We've got two in Japan, for example. So we have a network of global offices. About half the 600 people we now employ are based in the northeast of England, in Newcastle, but we have a very significant presence in Asia, where approximately 30% of our business is. We're very significant in Greece too, which is historically been one of our most loyal and engaging markets. I think we've got some very long-standing relationships in that market, and it's been a very productive relationship for both sides. I think they've been very supportive, and we've enjoyed working with them.
Are there any pressing needs you think the industry needs to solve? I mean, over the course of this enormous amount of growth that you talked about, what are the things that have really stood out maybe as novel new issues that haven't completely been solved when you evaluate maritime risk?
That's a very good question. I'm going to fast forward. I mean, the issues that challenged us as we went through this sustained period of growth are now very different to the issues we face today. I think, and I'd like probably to focus on the issues that the shipping industry and on our industry is facing today, probably rather than the challenges of growing, which was largely about just having a very agile product and really good service. I mean, that it was relatively uncomplicated. Contrast that with today, and we have a very complicated environment for shipping and insurance. We're going through one of the most profound periods of transition I think we've ever seen. I don't think we all recognize just how big a transition it is. Post World War II, shipping and its sort of service industries of what insurance is one have all benefited from a rules-based order established by the winning countries after World War II. And institutions which were developed to support those, institutions like the World Trade Organization, institutions like IMO. And by and large, everyone at a faster or slower pace, Russia, for a long time was outside this, but more recently had sort of been brought into it. We're looking at ways in which they brought down trade barriers and facilitated greater trade, and everybody benefited, to the point now where you buy a television, it's shipped across the world from a factory in China, ends up in your living room, and the cost of that transportation is absolutely fractional. But that world is under challenge, from the United States in particular, who's questioning really whether this model is beneficial to its own electorate, but sort of more generally as well, with the emergence of China as a significant economic power, which says, well, we don't necessarily agree with these rules. We want our own say in these rules. We need to be treated as an equal partner, and I think those are desires which absolutely have to be respected. But the challenge we've got and we start to face now, particularly as we have a country like Russia, which is if you like a fading power, and therefore probably at its most dangerous as it tries to protect itself from becoming a reduced economic power, is profound instability. It's like the plate tectonics, the geopolitics are sort of shifting, and that's creating an environment where you guys have sort of stepped into in terms of sanctions compliance, and so on. We'll talk about that a bit more later on. But the other really big thing that we are having to deal with is the consensus view, doesn't matter whether you believe it individually or not, is that the planet is heating up. And the consensus view is we need to do something about that. And the consensus view is that shipping must play its part. And the consensus view within shipping is that they will do their part. So we're all aligned on that, the need to do something. The challenge that shipping has is that the technology simply isn't available at the scale required to sustain the industry at its current levels. What do I mean by that? Well, we might talk about there is no obvious replacement fuel for oil at the moment. There's a lot of businesses and industries looking at particular options, but the simple, bold fact of the shipping industry is that there is nothing that replaces oil on a like-for-like basis in terms of its scale, in terms of its availability, in terms of its calorific content, in terms of the size of tank that you need to put on your ship to power your engines. And on top of that, we have really significant investment by nation states in the infrastructure necessary to support it. You might be able to achieve that if you're a liner operator. You're sailing from China to Europe. You can put methanol plants all along the way. Much more difficult for the tramp bulk operators who might be taking cargoes from soybeans from South America to China, then down to Australia, then across to Europe, and then back down to South America again. There simply isn't developing at scale the supporting infrastructure for the different fuel needs of these ships coming in. So really, really challenging period. And the last new transition piece really is the impact of technology. And I think technology is the elephant in the room. We all know it's there, but we really don't understand how it's going to impact us. How it's going to impact us as an insurance industry, how it's going to change our processes, our use of data, our pricing of risk, how that's going to change in the shipping industry, the crews that are needed to crew the ships, the cargoes they carry. To what extent does 3D printing replace some of the finished goods that people are carrying, and the rules and regulations that go around them. So there is an awful lot going on in the shipping industry at the moment. There is an awful lot of new risk being assumed, and there is an awful lot of change coming, and that provides both risk and opportunity.
Wow. There were a lot of really interesting topics you touched on in there. I want to just take a step back and go to a couple of them. So the first one you talked about is kind of the current political climate where, there is this tradition of globalism that has created a lot of wealth for a tremendous amount of people, right? Global trade has absolutely exploded post World War II, as you talked about. But it has had some detrimental effects, right? There have been, some casualties of this. There have been people who feel like they've been crushed under the wheels of progress, right? And that's why there's a bit of a populist backlash going on in the Western world right now, right? So this, as you pointed out, creates a potential threat to the shipping industry, right? If we have less global trade, we have less ships, we have less value being transferred across borders. I think it's interesting because shipping is the membrane that kind of connects the global economy. It is the means by which everything in the world is brought together, and we have mutually beneficial trade. And you highlighted, I think very rightly so, that there are significant challenges to that right now. You mentioned the United States, right? There's a lot of that coming out of the U.S. right now. I'd argue there's also a populist movement in Europe. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on that in a little bit more depth? What do you think about that kind of, and you don't have to express any political opinions, right? But what do you think about that dynamic of progress, right? That fact that we've, via globalism found a way to produce more value overall for the world, but maybe the gains are a little bit less distributed.
Yeah, I think we've gone for whatever it is, 80 years without a significant international global conflict, and we've perhaps all become a little complacent. We perhaps don't realize how wealthy we all are. I'm sure it's the same in the US, certainly the UK. People coming out of the back end of World War II were far, far poorer than the sort of underprivileged section of society in this country are today. There's far more state support for them. But it's not for us. It's not for shipping really to solve these problems. And I whether you invited me not to express a political opinion or not, I actually think it's profoundly helpful to politics into this. Let's just deal with the factual situation, which you summarised very accurately, that we've got in front of us. That is the fact. The United States, for example, is looking to protect or reinstate or reinvigorate industries that have been lost to other parts of the world. There are movements in Europe which similarly represent people who feel that they haven't had their proper share of the value that's been generated in the post-war war world. We've got to navigate this somehow. We're not going to change. Shipping is an incredibly important industry. It moves 90% of everything, but it's not going to change the world. It's going to serve the world. And if the world that we serve is changing, then we just have to recognise that and find a way to serve the new world we're moving into. I do think it has a role in bringing people together. It is an international industry. I'm lucky enough to have spent most of my career in it. Traveled around the world, met people from all different sorts of religions, races, faiths, and everything else. And we are all the same. It's one of the great things that I've found. I really enjoy working with my Chinese colleagues. I really enjoy working with my American colleagues. We had them on the same platform yesterday, sorting out the world's problems. Absolutely brilliant. Because we're all shipping people, and we all understand what binds us together is far, far greater than what pulls us apart. But we're not going to change that, at NorthStandard P&I or SynMax or the shipping industry generally. We're just going to have to sit there, work out what trade looks like after some of the policies that are being introduced have come into effect, and find ways to serve the markets that they are trying to forge. And let's not get above ourselves. Let's just deal with the ball that's being played, to use a cricket analogy.
Well, yeah. Cricket. Any other sport, yeah. I think the analogy works across borders, much like shipping. It brings us all together. There's a ball in every sport.
Absolutely.
Okay, yeah. I mean, you touched on something else that's really interesting, right? And it's the environmental concerns that have kind of been impacting the shipping industry. And I understand this isn't directly related to the insurance business, right? But it seems like you have a view on this, and it's really important, right? So the shipping business, it runs on bunker fuel, right? For more or less, right? And there are no non-carbon fuel-based alternatives for it, but I mean, there is LNG. And LNG, I think, has been making, I'm not an expert on this, but it has been making an impact. There are ships converting over to it. It is a far cleaner fuel than bunker fuel. It's a more expensive fuel. But I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
It's not a subject which I'm particularly expert. I think it's certainly, as you say, it's a cleaner fuel, but there are issues with it as well. Methane slip, I think, being one of them. I think most well-informed commentators see it as something of a transition fuel to sort of cleaner, longer-term alternatives. We'll wait and see. From my particular point of view, in ensuring a ship that's carrying LNG, it's great. If you spill it, provided it doesn't blow everything up, it's going to disperse, and we're not going to have a significant big cleanup bill. So it's not a bad risk. The challenges really are for the ship owners who are sitting there saying, well, do we go LNG, do we go ammonia, do we go something else? And I think that's a profoundly difficult problem that they're all having to wrestle with at the moment.
Yeah, for sure. And then you also talked about Russia a little bit, just as a declining power. So, there's been a lot of geopolitics, obviously, with the war in Ukraine and everything. So how have sanctions against Russia, particularly the maritime transport of Russian crude, impacted the oil trade and impacted the maritime shipping industry?
So Russia has been a profound event for shipping, simply because the sanctions that were introduced by the European Union Group of 7 and coalition countries have been extremely far-reaching, because Russia was a significant G20 economy. So if you look at the economic impact, I think there was a bet in Russia that they would not, that the Europeans would never dare target the oil trade, and they did, because the feeling of moral outrage about what happened in Ukraine was so extreme. And that has meant lots of things. That has meant that they've had to devise a scheme which is, I like to call it a smart sanction. The same way we have smart weapons, we have a smart sanction, because for the first time, the oil price cap scheme, which is designed to control Russia's ability to earn money from one of its primary exports, it doesn't prohibit the carriage of a particular cargo. It seeks to restrict its price. Much easier for us to police a sanctions regime which says you can't insure ships carrying oil. Much more difficult for us to police a sanctions regime which says you can only insure ships which are carrying oil at a certain price, particularly if we're relying on essentially bits of paper saying it's okay, this cargo was sold at a particular price. It makes it extraordinarily difficult and extraordinarily challenging for our industry. That's the sort of direct effect. We know we've all had to wrestle with that, and I worked very hard with governments in the run-up to the introduction of that particular policy. But I wouldn't underestimate the sort of secondary effects of this regime. Russia's oil went to Europe. If it can no longer go to Europe, it has to go somewhere else. That has been good for ship owners, because you've had 10 tankers serving a particular a short sea service. Now you have 10 tankers serving a long sea, a longer sea route, and those 10 tankers therefore are spending more time at sea. There is demand. There is greater demand for those tankers, so the freight rates are going up.
More charter days,
and so on and so on. And then the tertiary effect of that, of course, is that the price of second-hand tankers has gone through the roof. So if you're a traditional Greek ship or any ship owner, and you make your money A, through trading your ships, you've been doing very well, or B, selling ships that are end of life, you've been doing very well, because the second-hand market has the demand for tankers has gone up, simply because the world oil transportation system needs more tankers to service the to service markets. So lots of impacts. That's a very quick overview. It's been an incredibly busy time. State expectations of us have been very high, and it's all been very fraught because the stakes are exceptionally high. I wouldn't underestimate, particularly in Europe, just how significant the Russian intervention in Ukraine is perceived. This is a threat that we haven't seen really in 80 years, and nobody is downplaying it or taking it lightly. And that means that if we in the shipping industry get in the way of the overriding policy objective, which is that Russia doesn't earn too much for its exports, then we get squashed. And we just need to be absolutely realistic about that. Make sure that we're doing our bit to comply with the law that it applies to us.
It's a real interesting point you brought it up about the price caps, right? So the cargo itself is not sanctioned; it's just sanctioned at a certain price. And obviously, Northstandard and no other reputable insurance company is going to deal with anybody who's breaking the law, right? You're always going to make sure that your clients are on the right side of the law. But gosh, I mean, yeah, that's hard, right? They're carrying Russian crude, and you may have paperwork that says that it's being sold at a certain price. But what obligation actually falls to you versus the regulators to ensure that this is that they're being compliant? Because obviously, nobody wants to deal with non-compliant vessels.
Yeah, I think so. The way the oil price cap scheme, to sort of rewind to sort of October 2022, autumn 2022, when the scheme was being designed, as industry, we were saying, please don't go down the attestation route, go down a licensing route. In other words, we can only insure vessels that have a license to move the Russian oil. States being states chose not to do that. I think in choosing not to do that, they shifted the compliance burden from states, which is expensive because they then have to do all the compliance work of working out whether they can license a cargo or not, onto industry, and that's all well and good. But the scheme, I think we all recognise that there are flaws in the scheme, and the flaw is that if you're reliant on a piece of paper, it is not beyond the wit of the Russians or parties involved in the illegal export of oil above the price cap to forge a piece of paper. And how do you interrogate that? And how on earth can industry be expected to know what is a correct piece of paper and what is not a correct piece of paper? And that has been really challenging. You were very generous in saying that NorthStandard would never be involved with vessels breaking sanctions. Yeah, as far as possible, we're all over this. We have 30 plus people working on this flat out to advise owners to try and work out whether the piece of paper they've been presented with is can be relied on or not. Looking at what the vessels we insure are doing. Your company is very helpful to us in that regard. But this is, make no mistake, the cost of compliance has been shifted from government onto industry, and the consequences of us getting it wrong are really severe, and we've had to devote an awful lot of resource into an imperfect system to try and make it sort of work.
Yeah, it is. It's going to be difficult no matter who regulates it, right? Whether it's industry or government, but at least government has, the advantage of having access to information that potentially industry doesn't, right? And you're trying to prove a negative. It's very hard to prove a negative. How do I prove that something does not exist, right? How do I prove that there isn't some, behind the scenes transaction occurring at a different price for these cargoes than what is listed on the manifest and on the official paperwork that I get? And I certainly respect the fact that NorthStandard has devoted so many resources to ensuring this is possible, but I agree with your point, right? That you're in a little bit of an impossible situation trying to remediate that threat and ensure that these cargoes are legally transferring and that you're legally insuring all these vessels. Have you seen any attempts, with Russian cargoes in particular to subvert sanctions? I mean, some of the traditional ones we see when we're not dealing with price caps, or, we see spoofing and we see dark vessels and dark ship transfers and things like that. In a price cap environment, I would guess that isn't as necessary. So like the physical movement of the vessels is probably uninterrupted. Yeah. I'm guessing the answer is that it's just, a paperwork scheme behind the scenes that may or may not exist.
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. I think you've articulated very well the challenge that we have in complying with the price cap. We of course monitor our ships going into Russia, our ships when they go into Russia to lift any cargo, but including oil, of course, have to declare that to us. That's under the UK SPIRE system, and we require that information to be provided within 30 days. Thereafter, post February last year, we get per voyage attestation stating that the cargo is compliant with the price cap. I think there is, government trod a very fine line. That they needed industry to support the price cap because they were very concerned that if we didn't, the oil price would spike and grannies in Europe would not be able to pay their heating bills, and that would be politically unacceptable. Equally, they needed to constrain Russia's ability to generate revenue from its primary export and even manipulate the oil market. So we ended up with this deeply unsatisfactory scheme. I think sometimes it pays to take a step back to see whether it really, whether it works or not. What Russia did was to acquire a fleet of ships. I know we'll come on to this later on, to get round the scrutiny that was being applied by businesses like us. So it must have had some impact. Otherwise, they wouldn't have spent whatever it is, $14 billion to acquire a secondary fleet to carry their particular cargoes. You asked a very specific question: do we see unlawful practices? I'll answer that in very general terms, if I may, because it goes right to the heart of what we're doing. But the UK, I know, because I talk to them from time to time, were surprised at the lack of industry notifications of suspicious practices coming into them. And that was, I think, because not that we weren't sitting there looking at a piece of paper saying, is that really correct? It's just that we couldn't show that it wasn't really correct.
There was prove that negative.
Yeah,
really
and therefore, because the penalties for getting it wrong are quite high, we will all scurry off to our lawyers and say, well, look, oil is trading at $80 a barrel these days, the euro price of euros, and we've got one here saying it was sold at $45. Do we notify anyone? Well, you've done your due diligence. Yeah, you have your attestation. There's nothing obviously wrong with it. What are you notifying? And I think that's absolutely right. And I think the other point you made, I think is a very valid one, is really, covert deceptive practices aren't really necessary for this trade. It's not the trade itself which is prohibited. It's the price at which of the cargo on board, and therefore, there is nothing to be gained by Russian entities using a Greek or a German or a British ship to sail into Russia to load cargo. There's everything to be gained to fiddling with a piece of paper. It's the paper we need to see, not the ship carrying the Russian oil cargo. That's all declared.
It's the paper that you can't see.
It's the paper we can't see. Yeah, it's the deal.
Assuming it even exists, which I'm sure it does. Like all the anecdotal evidence that you provided, right, about Russia making these investments into ships, it suggests that there is something going on. But you talked about. Right. There really isn't any spoofing. There really isn't any dark ship transfers because it's generally not necessary. But can you explain where spoofing is occurring?
Yeah, I'd be wrong to say there isn't any spoofing. There will be times when people need to move oil from vessels to vessels, and so it's just not a dominant activity in that particular trade. So coming to your question, I don't want to sound complacent about deceptive practices in the Russian trade, for example. Because we're absolutely not. But where you don't have enough ships to move the cargo, countries such as Venezuela, Iran, which are also subject to quite rigorous sanctions regimes, or historically have been so, where they need to move the cargo off the ship that took it out of Iran onto another ship, onto another ship, onto another ship. That has certainly been an area where there has been considerable, historically and to this day, a considerable amount of deceptive activity. And also North Korea. Governments love talking about North Korea. I always sort of glaze over when they talk about it because generally the ships we insure don't I don't want to sound complacent, but it's not on my list of numerical risks. It's quite way down the line. The risk of contravening Russian sanctions is right up there because they are so difficult and there's such volumes of trade that are still permitted. The number of the last ship we spotted going into North Korea, we raced off to the owner and say, we've got a report here, and it says you went into North Korea, and we then had a large argument with them, and they were able to show that they weren't even spoofing the IIS. It was just a misreported signal. They were nowhere near North Korea, and they've been.
I think I know exactly the report you're talking about, by the way, because I believe SynMax then came in with the counter report, actually proving that they.
I couldn't possibly comment, but you might. I think we have a common memory, but that's a challenge for us, because again, don't underestimate the commercial damage we do when with the best intentions we're going out saying, please explain this, and we spend a week faffing around establishing that no law has been broken, and the owner, quite rightly, is very upset that they've had to sort of sit there and justify their activity to us when they've done absolutely nothing wrong whatsoever.
Yeah, naturally. I'm sure a lot of personal feelings get involved when you accuse somebody of doing something so egregious.
Yeah, and these are our owners. One of the great things about our industry is I know the people that we insure very well. So it's like me now to you saying you're a liar. You're not telling me the truth. It's quite personal in our industry, and having those conversations are necessary, but they're difficult. And if you're not right and you're factually incorrect, then big problem.
Talking about this report, right? I think, and without getting into too much detail, one of the deficiencies of this type of analysis is the fact that even when AIS data, which is that voluntarily transponded data that ships carry, really is a collision avoidance system, but over the past few decades, it's been kind of collected and aggregated and become an intelligence tool for people to, figure out where ships are going, where cargoes are flowing, and perform all kinds of maritime analysis. But it's not perfect, right? And it has cases where there can be GPS interference, there can be bad points that throw up through no fault of anybody involved, right? This is corruptible data going all the way to there are times when people spoof it, right? They can report fake locations, and they can do so increasingly well. With newer spoofing technologies coming up, all the way to them just turning the transponder off and going completely dark. And maybe they're probably not a vessel that carries insurance in the first place if they're going to that kind of an extreme, right? But it happens all the time. There's the global illegal fishing fleet out of China. There's obviously military vessels. There's tons of vessels that operate without insurance, engage in all kinds of nefarious activity, taking advantage of the difficulty that it is to track things on the ocean. So I guess I want to ask you. Are there any promising technologies that might shed a little bit more light on the 2/3 of our planet that is the ocean, that right now has become such a hotbed for nefarious activity?
That's another great question. A little bit of history, I suppose. We were tracking AIS long before it became main place back in 2011. And in the good old days, people would keep their transponders on if they went into Iran to load a cargo of illegal oil. And therefore, it was fairly easy to see, one of our ships has gone into Iran, give them a call and say, what were you doing in Iran? And they would take it from there. One of the problems with AIS is the prominence that governments gave it. And I was very much part of that discussion. I know why it got that prominence. But there was a fundamental misconception in that whole understanding on the part of government of AIS. I think they've got it now, but AIS was never designed to track ships. It's a collision avoidance tool, and there are circumstances when it legitimately can be turned off. There are circumstances when you don't get a good signal from it, and it's extraordinarily easy to manipulate. And we are in an arms race. In the good old days, people kept their transponders on going into Iran. It's been a long time since anybody was stupid enough to do that. And if they did, you'd assume they were spoofing. Nobody would be that daft. Back in 2019, I think it was, we identified activity off the west coast of Africa, and the ship involved was canny enough to be able to spoof its AIS so that even some of the most sophisticated ship trackers working on AIS could say nothing wrong with it. They knew the range of commercially available satellite coverage, so they'd moved their ship beyond that. And they also knew the range of shore-based synthetic aperture radar, so they'd moved beyond that. And
Incredible.
that was 2019. So we are now 6 years on from that, and Russia has moved mainstream into this. Russia is a large state with a highly sophisticated intelligence agency. They're if they want to, they can do all sorts of things. And I think when you ask about emerging technologies, one of the things that we've enjoyed about working with you is the recognition right from the start that finding what a ship is up to and doing is not just reliance on a single technology and trying to interpret that technology. It has to be a fusion of multiple sources. And I think probably the answer to that is that there are a number of products, and yours is a very good one, which will fuse intelligence. The more things you can fuse into that knowledge base, then the more likely it is that it is accurate. And I'd also go exactly the opposite way. One of the great things about P&I clubs is they have networks of correspondence. We have people on the ground. So if a ship says it's loaded oil in Basra and not Bandar Abbas, we can get somebody down and say, can you please check the port list in Basra to see if the vessel's actually called there or not, or if somebody says a discharging cargo or loading cargo in Bandar Abbas, we can get somebody out in a rowing boat to watch whether the ship's going up or down or not. I wouldn't underestimate that as part of the range of things that we have to use. Shore-based people with cameras is also part of that mix too. So, yep, you've got really clever stuff like such as that SynMax produces, and I know you're always looking at
Appreciate the shout out.
You're
From our sponsor.
You're always looking for new data sources, and I think that is absolutely the way to go. But it's also common sense and really just making use of all the resources you've got. I mean, the other area that's exceptionally used for us is ships have claims, if somebody doesn't tell us about a claim, that's an alarm bell. I don't like the phrase red flags for lots of reasons. We can discuss that later maybe, but I don't like the phrase red flags. But if someone's got arrested in India and they haven't told us about it, and the lawyer's coming on and said, can we act for you and your ship owner, and the ship's under arrest, and they haven't told us about it, that does something that they don't want us to know. If somebody's got stowaways on board, and somebody's been asked to repatriate them, and asked us to pay for it, and the ship owner hasn't told us, that's something we want to have a look at and understand. There may be legitimate reasons for it, but we want to have a look at that. And when we get the claims documents in, we get an awful lot more documentation when there's a claim in support of the defence of that claim than we ever would as sort of any sort of routine reporting. And sometimes it's apparent that things don't quite add up and don't quite sit with each other, and we can that prompts additional lines of inquiry. So the philosophy that you guys have of synthesizing lots of different data sources is absolutely the way to go. We have our own because we're operating in the region, and if you can introduce a few more into your technology packages, you and your competitors, that's got to be the right thing to do.
Yeah, I think what you're describing is what Brendan would call HUMINT, right, from the intelligence world. Yeah, and HUMINT is an essential resource that, it's difficult for a company like SynMax to get, right, because you have those relationships with those ship owners. You're very connected in the maritime industry, right? You have this human intelligence that nobody else has access to, which puts you in such an advantaged situation to be able to take that plus, the intelligence that SynMax bring you and other providers bring you, and really get the most complete picture that anybody have of what's happening in these incidents. I want to talk about kind of one of the themes that has been, coming up in the previous questions we asked, and that is the fact that there is a lot of novel risk in this industry, right? Obviously, global trade has been growing. Obviously, geopolitical threats have been heating up. I think traditionally insurance companies like a fire insurance company or a car insurance company, et cetera, they rely on this massive data set of actuarial tables, right, to determine their risk. And they have all the different features, and they kind of have all the different risk premiums, and they have a nice, rich history of everything, right? Gosh, wouldn't it be great to be in that industry? That they can look back and they can very precisely measure and price out these risks in their policies. But in the maritime insurance industry, I'm guessing that is not as much of a benefit or as possible because there's all these novel situations. So as an example, October 2023, right, we had Houthi rhetoric really heating up, right, but nothing yet definite had happened in the Red Sea, right? All these threats coming out from this terrorist organization that they are going to do things particular to disrupt global trade in the Red Sea, but nothing quite had happened yet. So, I mean, how does a company like NorthStandard navigate that kind of risk, in a situation where you don't have the hard data yet and you don't really have any historical precedent to fall back on to appropriately price out these policies?
Well, it's a good question, but I mean, I think we're served. I think it's interesting to look at the point of interaction we'd have on something like that. So the point of interaction would be a ship has been fixed to go from the Far East to Europe through the Suez Canal, the common route, and the ship owner is sort of approaching the Red Sea, and he's hearing all these reports, and he's clearly aware of the increasing risk, and they take the safety of their ship and they take the safety of their crew very, very seriously. And they will approach us and say, do we need to comply with the order to go through the Red Sea because of this increasing risk? And that is a legal question. And we have a very large team of lawyers here at NorthStandard called Freight Demurrage and Defence Lawyers, FD&D, who deal with these charter party questions and deal with these charter party disputes. And it is a question of assimilating the facts. And there does come a point in time when the facts are such that it is an unlawful order because it is clearly unsafe. And we will guide the owner in making that operational decision. And in the discussions, and assist them as best possible, the discussions they're having with their charter to say, look, we'd really rather go around the Cape for this one. Ultimately, we insure lawful trades. That is the sort of trigger point. We're not property underwriters; we're liability underwriters. So we're picking up the damage to third parties when there's been an accident. We don't. The trade through the Red Sea, notwithstanding everything that went on, remained a lawful trade. It was a very high risk trade, and if you were insuring the vessel's hull, then you'll have been charging very high rates for that, or your war risk underwriters have been charging very high rates. But there's nothing to stop you doing it, perhaps with necessary precautions, additional security, linking up with naval vessels in the region, that sort of thing. And if a missile hit your ship and you spilt oil, then that's going to fall on a different insurance to us. And there's nothing unlawful with the trade, so the vessel would have remained on risk. We would really only get involved if it was a very, very significant claim, very, very high value above the ship's retention. So, we help our owners. We try and provide them with guidance. We obviously get a lot of queries. We can assimilate information and disperse that to our owners. One of the advantages of being a larger club is we've probably got more access to data than perhaps some of our smaller competitors, and we guide them as best possible to make sure that they adhere to the law and enter any area of enhanced risk with as much knowledge as possible.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think of my old days, right? I used to work for a energy hedge fund as a quant, right? And so many novel situations will come up and there's so little precedent to be able to make decisions on. And, you're very much in the same position that a trader would be in, having to look at something completely novel in the marketplace and having to make a price decision as a result of it. How do I price in all these risks where I have so little training data and historical precedent to be able to make the right decision here, right? If I underprice it, it's a liability of the company. If I overprice it, it's a liability of the ship owners. And like you said, you have very close relationships to them. So finding that right number, right, like right in the middle is takes a lot of intelligence. It takes a lot of fusion of data sources and just a lot of skill in kind of understanding, what the possibilities are and how these situations evolve. So talking about Yemen, right? I mean, what do you think would need to happen to make that region safer? Recently, the U.S., brokered a ceasefire, right? So maybe that's a positive sign, but certainly it's certainly not the end of the threat over there.
No, it's not. I think everybody. I don't think the war risk premia have reduced significantly. I think there's a lot of inquiries about whether the situation has become safer in the Red Sea or not. I'm personally very mindful of the fact that there are discussions ongoing between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran, as we speak, about their nuclear program. I'm conscious of the fact that what the United States is asking for is not what the Iranians appear in print anyway prepared to give. And I'm conscious of the fact that Diego Garcia is full of American bombers. And if they're not there to bomb the Houthis because They've stopped attacking certainly American and to a large extent the majority of vessels. Then what are they there for? So I think we're all it remains a highly unpredictable and volatile region, and I don't think we're close really to seeing that resolved. It would get better if there was a new JCPOA. I suspect President Trump would not use the phrase JCPOA in any shape or form. He would come up with some other acronym, but some deal which achieved US and Iranian aims or compromised them sufficiently to reduce the tension in the region would I think restore some semblance of confidence. But we've still got a major war going on in the Middle East. I say a major war, quite horrific external casualties. And I think whilst that's going on, the region's going to remain highly unpredictable, very volatile.
Shifting gears slightly, what's your view on China's purported invasion or intention of invasion of Taiwan? I've heard so many opinions, right? We have the pleasure of working with a lot of people on the government side in SynMax. We have the pleasure of working with a lot of people in the commercial industry, right? It doesn't seem like anybody has a consensus on, the probability of a conflict occurring, how this would impact global trade, and even if they do believe it's going to happen, nobody really seems to know, when that threat could potentially emerge. So, curious to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I'm certainly not particularly qualified to rate the likelihood of a conflict between China and Taiwan. I think we're all aware of the risks, and I think we're all aware that there would be a significant impact on shipping if there was any form of conflict or increased commercial pressure applied to Taiwan. So there are a number of things that China can perhaps do to make life more difficult for Taiwan. They've certainly got the military capacity to impose a blockade on the island. There's nothing new about maritime blockades. The Royal Navy was doing it merrily in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century. It's a well-established tactic, and it doesn't involve people getting shot, which is what escalates things significantly. But it does create a significant degree of commercial pain and pressure. So I think I think we just have. I can't possibly have. There's so many people who will have much greater access to intelligence and understanding of the situation than a marine insurer would. We have to sit there and come back, play and do the basics. We support members engaged in lawful trade. It's lawful to trade to Taiwan. It's lawful to trade to China. We'll support our members who choose to do that. As and when the situation escalates, we'll have to look at what that looks like in practice. Is it full-scale military invasion? Is it some form of interference with vessels trading into Taiwan? Is it essentially an exclusion zone which prevents vessels trading into Taiwan, and deal with it as and when? But we're not there yet, and it's difficult really to second guess what states intend to do. I do think there's often a risk with these things that we talk up these problems, and because we constantly talk about them, they become more of a problem than they actually are. I'm conscious of the fact that to challenge, maybe the United States find this a little bit with China, but to throw down the gauntlet to China will pick it up. It's just in their nature. They will not back down. They're not going to show any sort of loss of face, and they've got an economy and a military that's capable of supporting them in that decision in a way that perhaps they didn't 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah. Changing gears again slightly. So you talked a little bit about the difficulties of trying to carry out legal proceedings and the importance of having kind of an international order in maritime trade. So where does that stand right now? Right? Where are legal proceedings carried out in a maritime domain? Right? Is it basically under the law of the vessel as it is flagged, or is there an international court to take these kind of grievances?
It depends what sort of dispute we're looking at, what sort of issues we're capable of resolving. The majority of shipping contracts are concluded under English law, a majority of them, and a large proportion of those are resolved by arbitration in London. The London Maritime Arbitrage Association, various other bodies are dealing with a high proportion of the world's shipping disputes. Other leading centres would be Singapore, New York, slightly lesser extent Hong Kong, but the vast majority is coming to London. So those are the sort of mainstream shipping contracts, sale and purchase, charter parties, that sort of thing. I think also what you might be alluding to is the conventions which sort of underpin international trade. So there we're looking at the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, and one that's come to prominence more recently is the Protection of Submarine Cables Convention of 1886. I think, a remarkable bit of foresight in drafting that, and they're resolved in accordance with that convention, depending which party has jurisdiction in accordance to the convention. So it may well be the states involved in a particular dispute. What I think is interesting there is this. Those two pieces of legislation, which have come under a lot of scrutiny recently, are really good pieces of legislation when they were drafted. But time has moved on, and the sorts of threats we're seeing now are rather different to the threats we saw in 1886. If you allow me to, a bit of an anecdote, I looked at submarine cables because there's an awful lot of excitement about that now, and rightly so, because merchant ships are being used, or the allegation is they're being used as weapons to pull up cables. So Russia's a contracting state to that convention, the United Kingdom's a contracting state to that convention, all the Baltic states are a contracting state. So they see, let's say we see a Russian ship pulling up a cable, and that gives the Royal Navy the right to sail up alongside that ship, send on a boarding party onto the Russian ship, collect evidence of whatever activity they've been up to, put it in a paper parcel, post it to the Russians and say, you're the flag state, could you please deal with these scruffy people who've been pulling up cables. And that's an example as to why, a piece of legislation which was drafted in 1886, which was there to deal with the problem as it was then, is simply not fit for purpose now. Now, the challenge we've got is if you are on the side of the fence that wants to uphold a rules-based order, which believes that it is important to uphold the rules-based order, what do you do when the rules don't work and are simply not fit for purpose in a modern day age? You're not going to be able to draft up another convention in the time you've got. You're certainly not going to be able to get sort of the numbers of signatories to adopt it in IMO in the time that you've got. So you're left with the unpalatable choice of either ignoring the law which you're seeking to uphold, and then setting an example for every other nation state to do likewise, or ignoring the activity, or perhaps the third choice, which I think increasingly we're seeing, is nations investing significantly in assets to protect that critical undersea infrastructure. But that really, long-winded answer maybe, but it sort of sets out really the problem that I know greater brains than mine are really starting to trying to wrestle with at the moment.
Yeah, 1886, like you said, that was a very long time ago, and obviously the threat of undersea infrastructure disruption has become more critical for communications between nations and carrying product between nations, right? Obviously a lot different than it was back then, and I think what you're talking about with, in the example of a Russian vessel breaking a cable, whether we believe it was deliberate or not, right? The current convention requires that the nation of Russia would deal with that. And maybe there's a political motive for them not to deal with that. And this convention needs to be updated, but unfortunately for it to be adopted, it would also have to be agreed to by Russia, right? So you find yourself in a situation where you want to uphold the law, and the law is currently inadequate to be able to protect it. So then what you're left with are these kind of other solutions to monitor and protect your infrastructure at, in many ways, as if there was no convention to begin with. Am I right?
Yeah. I think it's a problem that needs a huge amount of consideration. I mean, I think it's something like 10 trillion. You're from the financial markets, you probably know, something like $10 trillion worth of business is done through undersea cables every day. Significant amount of that is on in relation to a relatively small number of cables going from in Western Europe across the United States. So the ability to cause disruption is very real. And I feel slightly irritated by this discussion. Why? Well, our ships have been inadvertently pulling up cables for most of my professional career. It's a property damage claim. We pay for the consequences. And the reason,
it's typically just they drop an anchor in the wrong spot, right? These cables are everywhere, and accidents do happen.
It's worse than that. It's the people who sit the cables down don't bury them, and the people who put the cables down don't mark them on the charts in the right place, and and the
cables can drift too over time,
and they can drift. So it's a little bit harsh now to sort of wake up and say, oh gosh, we've suddenly realised there's a problem. There's been a problem for quite some time. And that problem would have been better addressed had cabling companies spend a little bit more money to protect the cable, certainly in vulnerable areas such as close inshore anchorages, that sort of thing.
Yeah, even if we take the deliberate sabotage or supposed deliberate sabotage out of the equation, right? It's not just about the value of the cable, right? It's about the value, like you said, the $10 trillion a day of informational goods or actual product that is flowing through these. And I mean, the most prominent example of that is when Nord Stream 2, right, was attacked. This wasn't just about the value of the actual project itself. It was this commodity, which is, essential for heating homes in Europe, right, that was suddenly cut off. And now the market had to scramble to find a solution for it. I mean, this is a fascinating time, I think, to have these kind of conversations with you, right? There's so much going on geopolitically in the oceans right now. And you are responsible for pricing and risking it. Maybe not you individually, but NorthStandard and other P&I clubs. I think it is not as appreciated as it should be, right? It's not something that we think about every day. The ocean, 2/3 of the Earth's surface, and it is the membrane which connects all of this global trade, which has made the world so prosperous the last 80 years or so. I want to thank you for your time and appreciate you coming on the podcast and hope we can do it again sometime.
Eric, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks a lot.